In this video, we will dive into Angular unit testing and end-to-end testing. And actually this video is a part of my full Angular testing course, and you can find the link to it in the description box below. But if you want to start with some coding challenges, let's jump right into it. Welcome to my course about Angular testing. It's so great to have you here. And in this course you will learn everything that you need to know about testing Angular applications. We will start with an empty folder and learn how to test our applications with unit tests and end-to-end tests. You will learn how to test utilities, services, components, words, and even NgRx reducers and components. We will use Jest as our testing tool for unit tests and Cypress for end-to-end testing. In this course you won't find just dry documentation, only tasks from the real projects. And additionally we will have a real project which we will cover with unit and end-to-end tests, so you understand how to do it right. By the end of this course you will be able to test Angular projects of any complexity. Who am I? My name is ekaterina, and I am a web developer with more than 13 years of experience, as well as a professional instructor with various courses regarding web technologies. I did my best to put all my knowledge inside this course, and I want to share it with you. So welcome on board and let's get started. In this video I want to talk why do we need testing at all. Here we are focused on Angular testing, but it is applied to any framework or language. When we first start implementing our project, we are totally fine. We have small features, not huge pages or difficult business logic. It all looks green and fresh, but after some time you can experience problems. Why is that? Because you are getting difficult logic or you are getting more and more bugs, and you might see that you are getting more bugs than you fix. And it doesn't even mean that you or your team are bad developers. It simply means that it is extremely difficult to develop a project with difficult logic without introducing new bugs. Even if the logic is not that difficult, every new developer in your team can potentially remove some code which he thought was not needed. All these problems can be solved with testing. For example, if we are testing some feature and we covered every single case with your tests, then you are sure that your feature won't break with all that cases. Obviously, it can happen that you didn't cover all cases, but it is much easier to just add a test case later than to try and fix a bug, potentially introducing new bugs. And from my experience in lots of companies, after we introduced even basic testing, the amount of bugs was significantly reduced. Additionally to that, if you are getting new developers and they change some code and they see that tests are red, they at least will investigate why tests are not passing, and maybe they will understand what exactly that code was doing and why it is needed. Which actually means testing is important. It is totally fine to start developing some project without tests, especially if you don't have strict requirements and you are evaluating lots of stuff. In this case, it doesn't really make sense because your code will change from week to week and you will obsolete lots of code and additionally tests which require time and support. So if you want your project to be stable, at some point you must invest time in test, and then the amount of time that you will spend on fixing bugs will be greatly reduced even when you need a little bit more time on writing tests. And additionally to that, if you have a difficult logic, it is much easier to test it with testing than to simply click in browser trying to reproduce every single case. I just wanted to remind you that under every single video where we have code, you can find the source code of the video attached. Which actually means if you have some problem, you can simply download an archive under the video, run npm install to set up a project, and you will see exactly the code of the lesson, which actually means you can easily compare your code to the source code or simply take the source code if you want to test the result. In this video we will generate our Angular project to start writing tests. And if you are viewing this course, I for sure think that you have enough experience with Angular to generate project on your own, but if you have any doubts, here is how you are doing that. First of all, you must install Node.js on your machine. I highly recommend you to always install LTS version because it is more stable. In order to test what version you have, you can write node minus version. For example, here I have version 18, which is older than LTS, but still will work. But we must be sure that our Angular version will work with your specific node version. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just wanted to let you know that only 20% of the people who watch my videos are subscribed to the channel. If you really want to continue getting videos and support my channel, consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now let's jump back into the video. This is why here we're on Angular your guide versions, and here are actively supported versions. What is interesting for us is Angular. For this course I'm using Angular 17, and here is the Node.js, which is enough for it to work, which actually means we can use starting from Angular 18 and later. If we're using LTS version, then we're golden. And if you already have Node.js on your machine, you have different ways how you can set up Angular project. Most popular is to install globally NgCli tool, which allows you to generate a new project. I prefer another method, which is called npx-p, then here is add angular/cli and the version, in my case it is 17, and then ng and the command. In our case, ng-new Angular testing course. And here you might say why I am using here npx-p and this package and not ng globally. The main point is that if you are using command like this, you can easily switch to any version. You simply write instead of CLI 17, for example 16, 15 or maybe 20, and you're good to go. You simply allow yourself to use different Angular versions on your machine. If you have a single ng globally, you can't really change it, and when you need to update it, you have pain and problems. This is why let's execute this command, and it will generate for us new project. Here we want to select that we prefer plain CSS, and we don't need server-side rendering for this project. This is why I'm saying here no. As you can see, my project was generated, and we can start it. So inside console we must write npm start and it will start our Angular project. As you can see, our project was generated. Let's clean it a little bit now. I want to jump inside source app, and we have lots of files here that we don't need. I want to remove app component CSS, app component spec, then we must jump inside app component HTML and remove everything except of router outlet. And we can write on the top, for example, h1 Angular testing course. Now let's jump to our app component TS, which is actually a standalone component because we're using Angular 17 and it generates by default all components as standalone, and we can simply remove here style URL and title because we don't need them. As you can see in browser, we successfully generated and cleaned our Angular application. Here we start a chapter about unit testing, and first of all we must answer on the question what is unit testing at all, why it is important, and why do we need to do it inside Angular. So as you can see here, I opened Wikipedia and unit testing here, and as you can see in computer programming, unit testing is software testing methods for individual units of the source code. Which basically means that we are testing code. We don't test a website, we don't test a finished application, we are testing a specific part of the code. And you might say, okay, but why does it make sense to test just a small part of our code? Sure, with it we can't really test like user clicked on the button or what blocks and elements are being showed on the whole website, but we can test a specific component or a specific function to make sure that it is working properly. And in almost all applications we are writing quite a lot of business logic, and typically we want to test all this business logic to make sure that we wrote our code correctly. In order to do that, the best possible solution is to write tests. Why that? You can certainly write console logs and simply console log your function with different parameters, but it is much easier to write a bunch of tests to test your function and see that all inputs and outputs are correct. And obviously we want to apply unit testing to Angular. Almost every piece of our code that we want to write in Angular we want to test, and we will use the unit testing for that. And the major part of our unit testing will go in the direction of utilities, services and components. In this video, we want to configure Jest inside Angular. The main question is, what is Jest at all? So this is the official website of Jest, and this is an extremely popular testing tool for JavaScript world. But the main problem is that inside Angular on version 17 and before, we don't get Jest out of the box, we're getting Karma plus Jasmine. What does it mean? Karma is a runner for our test, which means this is a system which runs tests. But here is an important point. I opened the official repository of Karma, and as you can see, Karma is deprecated and is not accepting any new features. Obviously, we won't use deprecated tool, and obviously Angular in the future will change Karma for something else. But for now, we didn't get that yet. Inside Angular 16 and 17, you can try Jest, which is allowed inside Angular, but only in development preview. It is not stable there yet. So what we don't want to use Karma, which is deprecated, with Jasmine. Jasmine is not deprecated, and we can use it to write tests, but they are much slower than just using Jest, and Jest is super popular nowadays. And it is extremely easy to set up Jest even without help of the Angular at all, because we simply want to run Angular tests. How can we do that? First of all, we must jump inside our project and install all necessary dependencies. First of all, npm install Jest, then Jest preset Angular and types Jest. So what is Jest? This is our tests runner and the system to write tests. Jest preset Angular is a preset to Jest, so we can write tests inside Angular, and types Jest are bringing for us support of types inside our TypeScript. As you can see, all packages are successfully installed. Now we must open our package.json, which is inside root of our project, and here we have command test, which is ngTest, and this command will use Karma plus Jasmine. We don't want that, we want to use here our custom command. So for test I want to run Jest. It means just a single run of the tests, but also I want to create a command test watch, because it is much simpler to use Jest with the watch mode when it will trigger our tests again and again with every single change. And in order to do that, we can use Jest watch. And after this, we need also test CI, because we want also to write later Jest on CI. For this, we need a command jest --run in band, which actually means it won't run our tests in parallel, but just one by one, to make it safe for CI and make sure that our tests won't break in CI environment. After this, we must create Jest config file inside root of our project, and it is named jest.config.js. Now let's jump inside this file and write here module exports, because this is just a config of Jest, and we must provide here first of all our preset that we installed for Angular, and it is jest-preset Angular. The second key that we want to create here is setup files after env, which means we want to call these files after Jest is set it up. And here we want to provide a file with our own settings. This is why here we can write root directory. This is the root of our project /setup-jest.ts. This is exactly what file will be called after setting up Jest. And we must create this file now. So let's create here setup-jest.ts. And inside we need just a single import. It will be jest preset Angular /setup jest. As you can see, we don't get any errors, and it means that we successfully configured Jest together with Angular. Let's try this out. Inside console, I want to call npm test, and it must call all our tests once. As you can see here, we're getting an output that no tests found, which is totally correct, and here we're inside Angular testing course and 28 files were checked, and it looks for the files either in __ tests or just files with spec.ts or .js. This is exactly what we will create together. And additionally, node modules is being ignored. If you see such output, it means that you successfully set it up Jest together with Angular and you are ready to start writing tests. In this video, you will learn how to test utility methods inside Angular. So what I mean by utilities? Inside our source app shared utils I prepared for us two helper functions. As you can see here, these are just plain TypeScript functions. There is zero Angular here, but these are reusable functions that you might need in different places of your application. They are not packed inside some service, which means you can reuse them anywhere, even where you don't have Angular, like for example when we're talking about NgRx reducers. And actually testing such utilities is the easiest way to test because they are completely isolated of Angular, they don't have any dependencies, and these are just plain functions. So as you can see here inside shared utils, I have utils.ts. Typically, if we want to test a file, we're creating the same file but with spec suffix. For example, utils.spec.ts, and this is exactly file with such suffix for which Jest will look and it will find it. This is why I want to jump in the console and run npm run test watch, and it will start Jest in a watch mode. As you can see here directly, Jest sees our file which was changed, and this is source app shared utils.spec.ts. And here we are getting an error, your test suite must contain at least one test. This is totally fine, but here I want to show you how amazing Jest is. You don't really need to configure anything, Jest understands almost always what files you changed and for what files it must run tests. It won't run tests for all files, but only for changed. And as we typically are using Git, Jest will check what files were changed with Git and will just run tests for that files. Additionally, as you can see here in watch usage, we can select to run all tests with A, only failed test with F, then we can filter our tests by regular expression, or we can quit a watch mode. Realistically, you don't need to change anything, just run the watch mode and it will test everything just fine. So now let's start writing our test, and we start writing our test with word describe. And here we're getting it from Jest, and this is a global keyword, you don't need to import it. And what is describe? This is a section of our test, which actually means when we're testing some method, we have lots of different tests, and we want to combine all them together inside this single section. This section is called describe. Here on the right, I want to open our utils.ts. This is exactly what we are testing. As you can see here in utils, we have two things. We have a range function and plug function, which actually means we want here to write that we are testing our utils, which is the whole file, and here as a second parameter, we have a callback, and now inside we are writing our test. So we can write here, for example, it, some name of the test, and here we also have a callback as a second parameter, and now we can write here expect, and this is also a reserved word, and I can run, for example, expect1 to equal 1, which actually means inside describe we're creating a test by using it, so it means a test. Now here we're providing a name of this test, and inside we're writing some expectations, like expect 1 to be 1. We can jump inside console, and here we're getting from Jest, one test is passed, and here is the nesting, we're getting utils, and inside we're getting our test, some name of the test, and it passed. So describe is our section, it is our test, but we can do even better. Let's imagine that for our range function we must write several tests, and then for plug we must write several tests. We can just throw these tests like a flat list, but it doesn't really help us to structure our test. This is why it is much better to put one more describe inside our describe, so we can nest describes as much as we want. In our case here, it makes a lot of sense to create a describe for range and then pack all tests which are related for range inside range, and then create one more describe for the plug. This is why here I will copy paste the code and write here describe plug, and here will be some tests. As you can see now here our tests are running and we're getting nice nesting. We have here utils, then range function and plug function, and we're getting some tests inside for our range function and plug. Now let's start testing our range function. So first of all here we need some meaningful naming for our tests, and typically we want to write it like plain English. for example, eat, and then a verb, because we want to write what it does. For example, eat returns correct range from 1 to 5. So what range function does, when we provide the start and end values, it will generate an array with these numbers between these two values, which actually means here we can call our range function. In order to do that, on the top we need to import it. So we're importing our range function, and it comes from utils. Now here inside our expect, we can write range with two parameters. Our start number will be 1 and our end number will be 5. And as you can see here, TypeScript screams that argument of type number is not assignable to parameter expected array-like, which actually means, as you can see here inside range, we're getting back an array of numbers. But here I am trying to compare it with a number and it doesn't work. This is why here what I want to do here, I just want to throw inside an array with 1, 1, 1. As you can see here, this is what we're getting. Our test fails, this is why it is red. We have full understanding where the test fails, because this is utils, then range, and then returns correct range from 1 to 5. This is exactly the test that we wrote. Now here in green, you can see what we want. This is expected, and we want here array of 1, 1, 1, but we received here 3, and it is an array 1, 2, 3, 4, which actually means as we're getting mismatch, our test fails. And here we even see the line where this test fails. And it is extremely important to always fail first, because you don't really know if you wrote your test correctly. If you fail your test, then you will see the correct response in the test. After this, you can write a valid test. But if you didn't fail your test and then you are writing the test and it is always green, it might be that you missed something and your test is not working at all. This is why it is extremely important to always fail your test. So we failed our test here, and we know that the correct response here will be from 1 to 5. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, not inclusive 5. Let's check if it's working. As you can see now in the console, our test is green, which means we successfully wrote our first test. What our test does, it checks that our range from 1 to 5 returns our array of these numbers inside. And you might say, okay, it is totally fine to write just a single test. Yes, but sometimes you have different behavior for different numbers. This is why I want to copy this test and create one more test. It returns a correct range, for example, from 41 to 44. In this case, at least we're sure that it works correctly. So our range here will be from 41 to 44, and I won't change our output because I want the test to fail. As you can see here, the test fails, and we're getting here 41, 42, 43. This is exactly what we need. This is why here let's update our test to 41, 42, and 43. As you can see here, all our tests are green, and we successfully finished testing our first function. Now we want to write our test for another function, and this is a plug function. As you can see here, we already prepared a describe with plug, and now we need to create some meaningful test. For example, it returns correct result. Also, I want to add here that at the beginning you often don't really know what exactly you want to test in this function. You want to call it with some arguments. This is why it makes a lot of sense to just write here it foo, for example, or any string that you want, and you are writing your test, and when you are done, you understand fully what you are testing there, then you update your it. So here I just want to check that we will get the correct result. And what plug function does, it simply maps a single field from the array, which means we must prepare here some data. This is an array with objects, for example, with ID1 and name foo, then ID2 and ID3, and the names here will be bar and buzz. So our data array is there. Now inside expect we can call our plug function, and as you can see it is coming from our utilities, and we're providing an array of our elements. This is our data, and as a second parameter is a field that we want to get. Let's say we want to map our IDs. This is why here string ID, and again here we're getting TypeScript error that we're comparing with number, and it must be an array. I'm sorry for interruption, but I just want to let you know that I have lots of advanced courses on different web technologies where we create real applications and prepare for the interviews. You can find the link in the description box below. Now let's jump back into the video. Let's add here an empty array so our test fails. As you can see inside console, our test plug fails. It must return the correct result, and here is what we received. We expected our empty array, but we got here an array of 1, 2, and 3, which actually means this plug function takes all these IDs from our array of objects data and just maps them inside a single array, which means here the correct result will be ID 1, then ID 2, and ID 3. As you can see here, all our tests are green, and this is exactly how you can test utilities inside Angular. In this video, we will start to do some basic testing inside Angular services. This is why here inside our source app shared, I created a folder services with user service.ts. And here we have quite a simple service without any dependencies, without HTTP or RxJS. This is just some plain data. We have here a users, and this is a user interface, which I also prepared. So as you can see, user interface is inside source, app shared, types, and here is our user interface. This is just an object with ID and name. So here inside user service, we are defining that we are storing an array of users, and by default it's an empty array. Also we have here an add user method where we are providing a user, which is a user interface, and we are merging all our users that we have with this new user, and we are overriding completely our array of users. And here we have a method remove user where we are providing a user ID which we want to remove. Here we simply update our users by using filter, because this is plain JavaScript data, and we're overriding them inside these users. So this is the typical Angular service with some plain data. How can we test that? First of all, here we want to create our new file users.service.spec.ts, and we always start with our describe block, and here will be our name. It will be user service. It makes a lot of sense to name our first describe with the name of the entity that we are testing, like for example a component or a service. And before we start testing our service, we must prepare some setup to test this service, because we can't really just inject it and test. We want to create an Angular module, inject inside our service, and only then we can test it. So every single time when we want to test, for example, a service or a component, we must create a testing module and test them inside. This is why here we want to use such thing which is called before each. And what is before each? It's a block which will be executed before every single test. This is why if we need the same stuff in every single test, it makes a lot of sense to move it to before each block. Now here before our before each block, I want to create a property which will be a reference later to our user service. This is why here let user service of type user service. And as you can see, it was auto imported here on the top. Now inside our before each, what we want to do, we want to write test bed. And as you can see, we are importing test bed from Angular core testing. And we want to call here testbed.configure testing module, which will create a testing module. And inside we must provide an object with some parameters. And you can think about this testing module as a simple ng module, which actually means we can use here things like imports or providers. In our case here, what we want to do, we want to register this service inside our module. This is why here we are defining providers and we are throwing inside our user service. So what it does, this code created testing module with provider user service inside. But what we didn't do, we didn't get access to our user service inside this module. This is exactly why we need this user service property. So after our configure testing module, we want to write user service equals testbed.inject, and inside inject we are providing a token what we want to get. In our case, it's a user service. This is why here inside this property, which will be available in all our tests because this is written in our root describe, we will store a reference to user service inside this module. So this is the whole code that we must prepare for any test of services or components inside Angular. And after our before each block, I want to write at least one test, and this test will be to test if our service was created at all. This is why here we're writing it creates a service. And here we have our callback, and what we want to test, we expect that our user service to be truthy, which actually means it will be green if our user service is available, and by default it is undefined, it won't be available. As you can see here inside console, my watcher is running and just understood that we're testing here our new file user service spec.ts. Here is our user service, and our test is green, it creates a user service, which actually means our full setup is ready and our user service is available. Now here on the right, I opened our user service that we want to test. And first of all, you must understand second extremely important thing about unit testing. You should never test plain values, but we are testing behaviors. It doesn't really make any sense to test your values, but it makes a lot of sense to test different behaviors and different scenarios of your code in your application. Which actually means, does it make any sense to test that we are getting here a user's property and it is empty array? No, this is just a plain value. Yes, we can write this test, but it won't bring anything for us. What makes a lot of sense to test is, for example, this addUser function, because we want to know how this function changes our data. The same we can say about this removeUser function. This is why here, as always, I want to create a new describe block, and this is a block for our function, and our first function is addUser. Now inside we want to create our first test, and the name will be should add a user, because what it does, it adds a user to our array of users. And here is our callback. What we want to do here is to call addUser, and in order to add a user, we must prepare it first. This is why here let's create a new property user, which is of type user interface, and this is totally fine to use interfaces inside our test. And this is an object with two fields. First of all, ID, let's say for example 3, and our name will be foo. Now after this, what we want to do, we want to call our user service dot, as you can see we have full access, addUser. And I'm providing here a user. Why do we have access to this user service? Because our describe and did are written inside our root describe, and we're defining this user service property in our root describe, and it is available for us here. And after this line, our array was changed inside user service, and this is exactly what we want to test. So we can write here expect user service dot, and as you can see we have full access to our users, to equal, and we want our test to fail. This is why here I am returning an empty array. As you can see here, our test must fail. Yes, it fails, and we are getting that expected an empty array, but received an array with object ID and name. This is exactly data that must be pushed to our array, which actually means our addUser function is working correctly. So here we want to write to equal, and here we are getting ID 3, and our name will be foo. Let's check again. As you can see, our test is green because we successfully covered it with our test. Now let's test another method, and it will be removeUser. So here is our describe and removeUser, and we have our callback. And here we also have a test, and it should remove a user. So here we have our callback inside our test, and first of all, in order to remove a user, we must create a user inside our users array. And we can directly do that with user service dot users, and we can assign here a new array. For example, here we have ID3, just like we used previously, and name foo. And with this single line, we successfully updated plain array inside our service. After this, we want to remove this user, so it will be user service dot remove user, and here inside we are providing an ID. In our case, it is 3. And after this, we must write our expectation. So what we're expecting that our user service dot users will be empty, dot to equal, and inside we must provide an empty array. Let's check this out. As you can see, our test is green and we successfully tested remove user function. So as you can see, with plain data inside service, it is extremely easy to test it. You simply call a method and you check how variables were changed. Most importantly, this is how you are creating your testing module and inject a service inside to test it. And secondly, you always must focus on testing behaviors and not just simple values. In this video, we must talk about mocking and spying inside unit tests. This is why you can consider this video as extremely important. And just to remind you, inside our previous video, we covered with our test user service. So here we covered remove user and add user. And this is our service. It was just users array, add user method and remove user. But here, as you can see, I added a new service, utils service. And actually it looks extremely similar to our utils helpers that we tested previously, because essentially I just took these two methods like range and plug and I put it inside our utility service. And I did that to show you how we can mock and spy in our services. So what is the idea? Let's jump back inside our user service TS. So what we want to do here is inject our utils service. And we're using here inject keyword and we're throwing inside our utils service. Most importantly, we want here to have a dependency inside our service. So now our user service is not isolated, it is using inside utils service. And it allows us to create a new method, for example, get usernames. And this is just a function and we want to get back an array of strings. In order to do that, we can simply return our this utils service dot plug, and we already know this function. We can throw inside our array of users and then a name, which actually means we want to get only array of names of our users. This is all awesome. This is typically how we inject one service inside other and reuse methods of it. But what problem do we have? Now our user service has as a dependency this utils service. Let's have a look if our tests are green. As you can see here, they are not green. We're getting an error inside, for example, remove user, should remove user, no provider for utils service. Why it happens? Obviously, inside our user service spec, we're defining our testing module and it knows about user service, but it doesn't know anything about utils service. What we can do here, we can simply write utils service as a provider, and then here restart our tests. And as you can see, everything is green and we fixed our issue. But here is an important point. As I already said previously, we don't want to check values, we want to check behaviors. And additionally to that, you always want to check it as close to the user as possible. Realistically, we're using here user service and it uses in our code utils service, which actually means they are tied together. And actually, this is totally fine to just write your test like this, where you simply inject it inside utils service and you are good to go. This is a normal test. But some people can say that this is not good. Why that? Some people think that you must only test your tests in isolation, which actually means it is bad that we injected here utility service and in our test we are not allowed to use utility service. This is entirely not true. There are different use cases for different problems. In our case here, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to try and mock this utility service, so we avoid using it and test our user service in isolation. Because essentially this utility service doesn't impact our behavior a lot. This is just some helper function which returns for us usernames, for example. So the first way to test is simply to throw all your providers inside this array and you're good to go. But there are other variants. For example, let's say that we really want to test our user service in isolation and we don't want, for example, utility service to impact our tests, which actually means we must mock utility service. What does mock means? We simply throw in our test, instead of this utility service, some plain object or some prepared data which don't have anything in common with our utils service. These are just some prepared data or mock data and not exactly this service. In this case, we're on the safe side because we're testing our user service, but we're doing it completely in isolation because we mocked its dependencies. This is where mocking is coming from. How can we do that? We can write here on the top const utils service mock, and this is just an object. And what we want to create inside is plug function. And here we're writing jest.function. Now instead of utils service here, which is our dependency, we can throw inside an object and write provide utils service, and here will be use value utils service mock, which essentially means here we're saying instead of this utils service, please use our mock. Just to remind you how utils service is looking like, this is just an object with range and plug inside. What we're doing here on the top, we're creating an object just with plug. So if we're using in our test somewhere range, our code will be broken, but we don't, we just test plug. This is why here we're mocking only plug. So what is plug in this case? This is jest function. And this is exactly what creates mock. So what is jest function? This is just a function which we can use inside our test. We can check if this function was called, for example. But essentially this is just an empty function which does not do anything. So if you want to mock something, you typically write such provide with use value, you are creating your mock, and then you can write your test. As you can see here inside our test, we are getting now an error, cannot find jest. Why does it happen? Because essentially we forgot to change one line inside our TypeScript configuration. This is why our TypeScript, which is used for our specs, so for our tests, doesn't know anything about jest. This is why here we must jump to our root, and here we have a file tsconfig spec.json. This is exactly the file which is being used only for our tests. And as you can see here inside types, we're getting Jasmine and we're not using it at all. Instead, we must write here jest and we are golden. Let's have a look. As you can see now, all our tests are green. So our tests are passing because essentially here we mocked our utils service, but we're not using it inside our add user or inside our remove user, which actually means we must write a new describe to cover our new function. And our new function is get usernames, and we want to write at least one test. So here we want it should get usernames. So what we want to do here, we want to write expect user service dot get usernames to equal foo. But essentially you must understand that our users array is completely empty. Let's have a look here. As you can see here, we are getting expected foo received undefined. Why it happens? Because essentially we are using our mock, and our mock doesn't deliver anything. So this plug function doesn't do anything, it is simply undefined and it returns undefined. What we can do about that? Typically when we have our mock, we can provide some value that our mock must return. So here we can write our util service mock dot plug dot, and here we have a possibility to write mock, and we're getting lots of different functions. Typically you want to use return value, and inside we can provide what value we want to return, for example foo. So what this line does, it simply says that when we're inside our service and we're calling this user service plug, which doesn't matter what parameters, the result of this function must be foo array. This is exactly what you see on the top. This line will never call a real utility function, but a mocked variant. And as you can see, our test is green. So we're using mock when we want to mock some function, for example, from external service or external provider. And in this case, we're using mock. The typical usage is create mock, inside throw just function, for example, and then on this just function like plug, we can write mock return value with some value. What I want to do now, I want to comment out this code, and I want to comment out our mock on the top. And now instead of our code that we wrote with provide for mock, I want to return here util service. And now what I want to show you is an alternative to mock, which is working in completely different way, and it is called spy. So with mock, you understand it, we simply mock our result, so we're using some another value for our result. With spy it is different. What we can do with spy, we don't replace the function or its result, we're spying for this function. So here we're using utility service, we don't have any mock, and what we can write here, we want to use word spy. This is why jest.spy on, and inside we're providing our util service, comma plug. And as you can see here, we're getting an error, util service is not defined. So we must get access to our util service. This is why here we must create utils service property, and this is utils service. And now here we can write testbed inject just like we did previously. So utils service equals testbed dot inject, and we're throwing inside our name, which will be utils service. Now we're getting full access to our utils service in any test. And here we're writing just spy on utils service plug. Most importantly, this utils service is a real utils service, but we're spying on this function plug. Now what I want to do here, I want to fill our users like we did here. So I will just copy this line to have some users inside our user array. Now after this, we want to call our function, so user service dot get names. And as you can see, I don't really care to assign results somewhere. Why is that? Because after this, we're writing our expectation. Expect utils service dot plug. So this is our spied function, and we can write here to have been called with, and we're providing all our arguments inside. And the first argument is our user service dot users, and the second argument is name, which essentially means here we don't have any mock, but we're just spying for this function, and we're checking with what parameters we called this function. And here we're checking, okay, we provided inside plug an array of users and our name. Let's see if it's working. Our test is green. So this is the main difference. With mock, you simply mock a function. With spy, you are spying for the function to understand what it returns or what parameters it gets. Now the main question is, what is better in this case? As I already told you, it is completely fine to not mock utility service at all, because it is super small and it doesn't change our behavior. Realistically, I don't see any point of mocking our utility service, because if we are doing that and this stuff is mocked, we can't really test anything good inside our getUsername function. Spy in this case is a better choice. Why is that? Because when we are writing our spy, we can at least check with which parameters we are calling our plug. And in this case, if somebody will remove a parameter from the function, we will see it in the test. You already know how to test plain services, but now the question is how we can test RxJS streams inside these services. And in order to test that, I want to jump back inside our user service and I want to refactor it to using RxJS. How can we do that? First of all, I want to remove utils service and this get names, because this video is not about that. Also, we don't need this import on the top and we don't need inject. Now after, I want to refactor this users array to behavior subject. And if you don't know, inside RxJS, behavior subject allows us to store values inside, update them as a stream and subscribe to it with .subscribe, which actually means this is what we typically use to store reactive state inside our service. And typically we are creating it like this. So we have our users with $, because this is an observable, and we're assigning here new behavior subject. Now here inside we're providing a data type. This is a user interface array, and the default value is an empty array. Essentially this code is the same like this code, but here we have a stream of data and not just plain data. Now we must make updates to our add user and remove user. First of all, here we can simply write, instead of this users equals, we want to write this users with $.next, and we're using next to update our stream. And we simply provide a value inside. But as you can see, this users does not exist anymore. In order to read a plain value from our stream, we can use .getValue function. In this case, this is a plain value. We're getting a new array, and we're providing this new array inside our user stream. Now we can do exactly the same here inside remove user. We can read users $getValue. And then we just need to update our stream. So here is this users with $.next, and we're providing updated users inside. And now we can remove our users comment. So this is how you typically store your data and work with them if you are using behavior subject with RxJS inside Angular. But now the question is how we must update our tests to make it working. Let's jump inside our user service, and first of all I want to remove here get names because we don't have them anymore, and utils on the top, so we don't need this line in before each with utils service and inject, and we don't need this let utils service. Additionally, just to avoid confusion, I want to remove all comments here and util service from our providers. And we also don't need this import on the top. So now we have a clean user service, but as you can see, it does not really work. We're getting TypeScript errors because we don't get users anymore here. But this code is extremely easy to update because when we're using behavior subject, it allows us not only to subscribe with .subscribe to it, but also to read the plain value from it at any time, which actually means we can write the whole test as a plain synchronous code. In this case here, for example, for add user, we're creating new user, we're calling user service add user, this is completely fine, and after this what we can check is .users with $, and here we can write get value, just like we did in our code. And now this code is completely synchronous and it just compares the plain value with this object. And just to remind you, typically in all your code inside components, you will use this stream like user service.users.subscribe, and then you will subscribe to it. We can do that inside tests, but it is much easier to use getValue if we are talking about behavior subject, and we will look how to use subscribe inside our tests in the later videos. But for now, let's also update our remove service. Here we want to assign value inside users by default, and we can do it with users $.next, and we're providing some default value inside our test. Then we're calling remove user, and then we want to check what is inside. So here will be users $.getValue, and it must equal to empty array. As you can see, we don't have any TypeScript errors. Let's have a look. All our tests are green, but now our service is fully implemented with the stream through behavior subject and discovered with tests. In this video, we will talk about testing our API requests. And in order to do that, inside our source app shared services, I created a new file API service.ts. And this is a server which has some methods with HTTP client. So here, as you can see, we injected HTTP client and we're making a GET request to get a list of tags from our API and also a create tag method, which must create it by using HTTP client post. And additionally to that, I created this tag interface, which is just an interface with ID and name. Let's try to test this service now. In order to do that, we must create a spec file, so api.service.spec.ts. Now, as we are testing here our service, we must inside our describe block prepare our testing module. So what we want to describe here is our API service, and inside in before each, we want to create it. So here we need to call our testbed.configure testing module, and inside we want to provide our provider, and it will be our API service. And additionally to that, we want to get full access to our API service. This is why we will create a property for it. So it is let API service is our API service. And after we configure our module, we can assign inside our API service our testbed inject, and inside we're providing our token, which is an API service. With this code, we're fully ready to start testing our service. What I want to do now, I want just to test if our service was created. This is why it creates service, and inside I'm just writing expect our API service to be truthy. As you can see here, I'm inside tests and we have an error. So what error do we have? We don't have a provider for our HTTP client, but we injected it inside our API service. And you might think that we must add here as a provider HTTP client in order to write tests, and we never do that. Why is that? Because all our tests are existing only in testing environment, and we don't want to make any real API calls. We can, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, because we want our tests to be really fast. And if we are making an API call, the response time will be too long. Additionally to that, we want to test everything in isolation when it is possible, and API calls are for sure something that we never want to do. In order to do that, we don't need to inject here HTTP client. What we want to do is add one import here, which is called HTTP client testing module. So what it does, it replaces HTTP client and allows us to create mocks and responses like we want inside our tests, which actually means every single time when you have your service or your component with HTTP client, you must add this line, HTTP client testing module, because you never want to test your real HTTP requests. And before we start writing our test, we must tune one more thing. What we want to do, we want to call a verify method on HTTP controller. Why that? Because we want to make sure that all our tests are resetted to initial state and we don't have any mocks between tests. And in order to do that, I want to create one more property which is called HTTP testing controller, and this is of type HTTP testing controller. Now, after our API service, we want to assign it, and this is just one more inject, which is coming from our HTTP testing controller. Now, after before each, we want to call after each, and after each will be called after every single test. And what we want to call inside is our HTTP testing controller.verify. It verifies that no unmatched requests are outstanding, which actually means we don't have any hanging things after our tests were executed. Everything is resetted. With that being said, let's start testing our methods, and our first method was get a list of tests. This is why here I want to create a describe block for get tags, and here inside we can pack all tests which are related to this method. For example, our first test can be should return a list of tags. How do we call this method? We're writing here API service.getTags, and typically any method where we're using HTTP client is returning for us an observable, which actually means we can't just read a result and compare it with something, it is an asynchronous process. This is why here we can write subscribe and we're getting back our response. The main problem is that you can't write directly here expect, it won't work because of asynchronous nature. There are different ways to solve this problem, like fake async, tick, and so on. I will show you the easiest approach, which is working in all cases and which I prefer. What we can do here inside our it, we can create a property where we will store our result. So I want to store here a list of tags, which will be our result, and this is either tag interface, array, or undefined. Why undefined? Because we didn't set it by default. Now inside our subscribe, we want to assign inside our tags the response that we got from the backend, because our response is our tag interface. And after our subscribe, we can directly write expect tags to equal, for example, an empty array. As you can see in tests, we're getting an error exactly inside HTTP testing controller.verify. Why is that? Because it expected no open requests, but found one, and this is HTTP localhost 3004/tags. This is exactly the API call that we made. What does it mean? We must somehow cover it with mock inside our it. In other case, it fails. Why that? Because this code makes an API call, but we don't really work with it inside our test. This is why this verify helps to identify such places. What do we need to do here? We can save here request as a result, and here we're calling HTTP testing controller that we prepared previously. And here, as you can see, we have different methods. And for now, we want to use a method expect one because we're expecting one request. And here inside, we must provide our URL. And in our case, it will be HTTP localhost 3004/tags. Let's check if we're getting any errors. As you can see now, it looks differently in our errors. We're getting expect received, and received was undefined, but here we expected an empty array. So essentially we don't have a problem with our API call anymore, but we have a problem that we don't get any response back. And we're not getting it because we didn't specify it. And in order to do that, we can use flush method inside request. So it is request, and as you can see here is flush, and we can provide inside any response that we want. In our case, we want to provide at least one tag. This is why here let's create an array of objects with ID1 and name foo, and this is our tag that we created. As you can see now inside our test, it looks differently. We expected an empty array, but we got back an array with object with ID1 and name foo. What does it mean? Our backend was successfully mocked with this code, and our HTTP client responded with this content. It is an array with this ID and name, which essentially means this is how we're testing HTTP. First of all, we're mocking it with the help of HTTP testing module, then we're getting access to HTTP testing controller, and then we can use it with expect1 to set what URL we're testing, and here we're using flash in order to provide some data in our response. And just to remind you, this is the code that we're testing. This is just this HTTP client GET, and we mocked it with this code and this response, which actually means here we can directly test without calling our API what will be the response. So the correct way here will be to just write that we're getting back an ID1 and our name will be foo. And as you can see, our test passed. And just to remind you, this was one of the ways how we're testing subscribe. We can simply create property before, inside subscribe we're assigning it, and then at the end we're expecting it. Most importantly is this expect1 line must be called after we're trying to do HTTP client, not before. We can't move this line here, it won't work. Why it won't? Because we didn't make HTTP request, and we're making it only when we're calling this API service.getTags. Now let's do exactly the same for our next function. So here we need a describe, and we want to cover here create tag function. And let's write just a single test. It should create a tag. And here we're doing exactly the same, just like in previous it. First of all, we're calling here API service.createTag, and we're providing inside the name. For example, it will be foo. Here we must use subscribe and get some response, but we want to save this response somewhere, so we need a property for that. Let's create a property tag, which will be a tag interface, or by default it will be undefined. And inside our code we can assign inside tag this response. Again, this code won't work because we didn't write an expectation. This is why I want to copy paste expect1 and flash and write them here. So what we're doing here, we're making a post request on exactly /tags URL, and we need to update our response because this is not an array anymore. This is just an object with ID1 and name foo, which essentially means we're trying to create a new tag with name foo, and we mocked our response from HTTP client to receive back an ID1 and name foo. And after this we can write our expectation. So we're expecting our tag to equal, and again I want to fail. This is why I'm writing here an empty object. Let's have a look. Our test is failing, but as you can see we got back an object with ID and name. This is totally correct. So we can update here our code and provide ID1 and our name foo. And our test is green now, and you learned how to mock and test HTTP calls and subscribe methods. So you already know how to test HTTP requests, but there is more to it. But what I want to say just at the beginning, I prefer not to do such checks. What I'm talking about? We can check everything inside our request. Like here, for example, we tested our create tag, and we can test what we passed inside our request, what is the data type of this request, what is inside body, and so on and so on. You can test lots of stuff, but realistically this is too low level. Will it really help you to make your code safer, or are you just duplicating variables between your code and testing? Probably the second. And this is for sure related to the point that I already made. You should not test data, you should test behavior. But nevertheless, I want to show you how to do that if you need it at some point. What I want to write here is one more test for our create tag, and we can write, for example, it passes the correct body. So essentially, I want to copy everything from previous test because it will be similar. We also want to make a create tag request, and we're providing inside foo. Our URL will be /tags, and we want to flash it with ID and name. But what we're checking here is not a response. This is what I typically do and what I recommend. We can test here different things. For example, we can write expect request dot request, and you should not be confused because inside request we're getting really the property request dot method, and inside method we're storing what method we really called. And here we can check to equal, for example, get. And as you can see, our test fails because we expected get but received post. Essentially, post is completely correct, so we can write here that our method is equal post. Also, we can test another things, like for example request.request.body. So we can test, do we really provided correct data inside our body? And here we can say name, for example, bar, which is not correct, to fail our test. As you can see here, we're expecting the name bar, but received name foo, which actually means with this single line we can test what is inside body of our request. So again, you may do that, but I find that it doesn't really help to make your code safer. In this video, I want to show you how we can test errors from our API. Previously, we tested only success, which is fine, but sometimes we want to be sure that we are prepared for throwing errors and our code won't break. In our case here, in our API service, it is not really realistic that something will break, because we're just making here HTTP client request and we're good. But even if this code looks simple, it might happen that some developer changes it later, which actually means it might be a good idea to write at least one small test to cover the error handling and if it is working correctly. And in order to do that, I want to create here one more test and write it throws an error if request fails. And again, what we want to do here, we want to call our API service.create tag with our name foo and we want a subscribe. But what we want here, we don't want just a success callback, how we're typically writing it. We want to handle here an error. This is why here I'm providing an object and we can provide several fields. First of all, we can provide next. What is next? This is our success. And here what we want to do, we want to write a function and this function should never be called, because we are testing here that it will fail. And in order to do that, we can write fail. And as you can see, fail explicitly mark a spec as failed, which actually means if for some reason your code is going to this next, you will get an error inside test because this is forbidden. With fail, we're forbidding the test to pass if we're coming to that specific case. And here we can write, for example, fail, success should not be called. And after this, we're checking the error. This is exactly what we want to check. We're getting here access to our error. And what we want to do is assign this error inside some property. So just like we did previously here inside subscribe. This is why here before I want to create a variable actual error. And here I want to store HTTP error response or undefine it, because by default we don't have any value. And now inside our error, we can assign inside our actual error an error. After this, we must expect for our request. This is why here I want to copy this request line, because we're expecting to get /tags request. And now what we want to do is use request flush. And previously we throw there just our response, but we can do more here. We can throw here as a response, for example, server error. And as a second parameter, we can provide an object with two things. First of all, it will be a status, and we can say, for example, that backend throwed us 422 status. And here we can additionally provide a status text, for example, unprocessable entity. And again, this is what you can typically get from the backend if you provided wrong data to it. So it is important that inside request flush, you can not only provide a response, but also a status code and a status text if you need that. And after this, what we want to do, we can just write an expect for actual error. And inside our actual error, we're getting the status. But as you can see here, I don't have any autocomplete. And it happens because error can be undefined, because it is not 100% that we will get to this error case. How can we fix that? We can simply check if we have an actual error. And if we don't have it, then we're throwing an error. For example, error needs to be defined. And as you can see now, I'm getting a nice autocomplete with all things of HTTP error response. And we're testing here actual error.status. And in our case, it should be 422. And additionally to that, it makes a lot of sense to test the message, so it is a status text. And we want it to equal something which does not exist. As you can see now, our test failed, because here we got unprocessable entity as an error, but we expected foo, which actually means I can copy the status text from here and write it in expect. So what this test does for us at all? We're trying here to create a tag, and if backend will answer for us with error, it will look like this. It will be just 422 or maybe 500, with some status text. And here we are sure that from our call to HTTP client, we can get back a status and a status text. And even if somebody changed the internal part of our function create tag, this test will be sure that the observable that we are getting back can be used to handle errors correctly. And this was the end of the first chapter. If you want to dive deeper into Angular testing, make sure to check the link to the full course in the description box below.